This is not merely a war of trenches and artillery fire. It was not limited to bayonets and barbed wire alone. World War I was also a financial war, a massive struggle fought within gold reserves, bond markets, central banks, and the hidden offices of financiers who had never set foot on a battlefield. While soldiers paid with their lives, bankers and governments calculated their balance sheets in the background. The steps they took during those years not only determined who won and who lost, but simultaneously reshaped the global financial system in ways that still trap us today. If you think the war was solely about politics and armies, think again, because money proved to be one of the most lethal weapons ever invented in this war. In 1914, Europe was already a powder keg. National rivalries, imperialist ambitions, and military alliances had turned the continent into a paranoid game. Yet beneath all the grand talk about honor and the right of empire lay a hard financial reality. A war of this scale was impossible without unimaginable amounts of money. When leaders chose war, they simultaneously chose debt. Every empire sending its soldiers to the front lines was plunging its people into a massive economic burden. Yet at the start of the war, most governments believed the conflicts would end quickly, perhaps by Christmas. They imagined they could pay for the war the old-fashioned way, with gold, limited borrowing, and patriotic donations. But this illusion collapsed within weeks. The war was burning through money faster than anyone could possibly imagine. In the summer of 1914, Europe's financial system was still built around the gold standard. Nations had promised that their paper money could be exchanged for real gold. This system gave credibility to their currencies, but also tied the hands of governments. Gold reserves were limited, and it was impossible to print endless money without losing the trust of the public or creditors. Britain, France, and Germany held respectable reserves, but costs soared once millions of men were marched to the front lines and industry was completely redirected toward armaments. Germany alone was spending more than 10 million marks a day by late 1914, and Britain's war expenses would soon reach £2.5 million every day. The mathematics was merciless. The gold was running out. In response, governments suspended the rules. One by one, the major powers abandoned the gold standard, quietly admitting to their citizens that money was now merely a promise backed by nothing more than belief in the state itself. The breaking of the gold anchor was one of the greatest financial transformations in modern history. Money and power were no longer tied to metal. They were directed by printing presses, credit, and the persuasion of political power. Once governments tasted this freedom, they never looked back. The financial war began in earnest at this point. Cut off from global capital markets and blockaded by the Royal Navy, the only option for Germany was domestic borrowing. Berlin launched massive bond campaigns that fueled patriotism, urging ordinary citizens to invest their savings in war credits. Propaganda continued unabated, and investors were promised repayment after victory. Through this method, Germany raised more than 100 billion marks, but this was a pyramid built on hope. When defeat came, those bonds were worth no more than scrap paper. The life savings of millions of Germans were wiped out, and this bitterness prepared the most fertile ground for future extremities. Britain, however, possessed a massive advantage. The City of London was the financial centre of the world. The pound was trusted, and British networks reached globally. The government initially leaned on short-term borrowing and patriotic appeals, but before long, it tapped into the deep pools of global credit. Most importantly, it turned toward the United States. In 1914, America was officially neutral, but its bankers had caught the scent of opportunity. Firms like J.P. Morgan and AMP Company arranged massive credits, becoming the financial lifeline for Britain and France, and managed purchases of weapons and food. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, Wall Street had already financed the Allied cause. This was no act of charity, but a pure power struggle. American bankers earned millions of dollars in commissions. The U.S. transformed from a debtor to a creditor, from a financial follower to a global leader. The foundations of the 20th century, being the American century, were laid not on the battlefields, but in these accounting ledgers. France faced its own dilemmas. Weakened by the costs of building defenses and bearing the scars of the Franco-Prussian War, the country relied heavily on both domestic and international loans. French citizens, known as savers, were persuaded to buy government bonds, but a large portion of the deep funds once again came from across the Atlantic. After the war, debts would accumulate, and this dependency would directly shape politics. When discussing the economic crises between the two world wars, it must not be forgotten that the issue was not merely reparations or stock exchanges, but the crushing debt burden accumulated during these 4 years of slaughter. Russia's financial war, on the other hand, was an absolute disaster. The empire was vast but underdeveloped, its banking system was fragile, and its gold reserves were impressive on paper but inadequate in practice. To finance its war efforts, it borrowed heavily from its allies, primarily France. However, as defeats piled up and inflation soared, faith in the ruble collapsed. By 1917, the Russian economy was in ruins, and the political system collapsed along with it. The fall of the Tsarist regime was not just about ideology or poor generals, but the tragedy of a financial system stretched to its breaking point. By the end of the war, the Allied powers had spent more than $140 billion, and the Central Powers more than $60 billion. These were figures the world had never seen before. The result was not just mountains of debt, but the total destruction of the old financial order. The gold standard, the foundation of global trust, had been shattered. Germany faced extreme hyperinflation, where a loaf of bread would cost billions of marks. Ordinary people, workers, and small savers were the ones who paid this bill. Wealthy elites protected themselves by smuggling their assets abroad. The connection to today lies precisely here. World War I was the moment governments learned they could finance the unimaginable by unmooring money from reality. They discovered they could suspend gold, print endlessly, issue bonds to their own citizens, and borrow from across borders. This playbook never disappeared. Every modern crisis, from the Great Depression to the 2008 global financial crisis, carries the echoes of 1914. When the war ended, the world was a wreck in terms of balance sheets as well. While America captured the world's largest gold reserves and creditor status, Europe was drowning in debt. To keep the promises they made to their citizens, Britain and France demanded an impossible reparation of 132 billion gold marks from Germany through the Treaty of Versailles. This unpayable debt spiral triggered the hyperinflation of 1923 and the anger that fed radical movements. Britain's effort in 1925 to return the pound to its former parity ended in a massive economic blunder, resulting in deflation and unemployment, while the wheels driven by US loans to Europe crashed into the wall with the Great Depression of 1929. World War I was the greatest turning point in economic history. It proved how governments could persuade the public through money printing, borrowing, and propaganda. Today, as central banks claim inflation is transitory, debt ceilings are constantly raised, and new money is digitally created, 1914 is what must be remembered. History does not quite repeat itself, but it rhymes. While those in power protect themselves, ordinary savers and workers always pay the price. True wealth is not numbers on a screen. It is resilience, knowledge, and the ability to see beyond illusions. Remembering how money turns into a tool of manipulation when disconnected from reality is the harshest and most vital lesson this history leaves us.